The studio lights of Tucker Carlson Tonight cast their familiar, almost theatrical glow as Tucker Carlson settled into his chair. The opening montage, a rapid-fire succession of images depicting urban decay, economic anxiety, and cultural shifts, set the stage for his nightly address. His voice, a low, resonant baritone, began its characteristic cadence, a blend of folksy concern and pointed accusation. Tonight's monologue, he announced, would delve into the true state of the American economy, a reality, he implied, that the establishment, media, and political class deliberately obscured. He launched into his familiar critique, painting a picture of a nation where the average citizen felt increasingly marginalized, where the promise of prosperity seemed to recede further with each passing year. He spoke of inflation eroding savings, of stagnant wages failing to keep pace with rising costs, and of a widening chasm between a disconnected elite and the struggling working class. His rhetoric was populist to its core, designed to resonate with those who felt overlooked and unheard. He used evocative language, conjuring images of forgotten towns and families grappling with a sense of decline, all while the experts in Washington and New York offered statistics that seemed to defy lived experience. The particular provocation, the claim designed to elicit a strong reaction from his ideological opponents, came when he pivoted to a seemingly innocuous piece of economic data, perhaps a recent jobs report or a GDP growth figure. "They'll tell you the economy is booming," Carlson stated, his voice laced with a subtle sarcasm. "They'll point to a number on a chart and expect you to cheer. But ask yourself, does that number reflect your reality? Does it reflect the reality of your neighbor or the small business down the street that just closed its doors? Because what they're not telling you, what they actively suppress, is the true cost of this so-called growth. They're celebrating a recovery that hasn't reached you, and they're doing it with a straight face." He then suggested that specific, widely accepted economic indicators were not just misleading, but actively deceptive, a tool used by the powerful to maintain control. He implied that the very metrics used to gauge national well-being were rigged, designed to paint a rosy picture that ignored the suffering of ordinary Americans. The monologue concluded with a rhetorical flourish, a challenge to his viewers to question the official narrative and to trust their own experiences over the pronouncements of distant elites. He ended with a knowing look to the camera, a subtle invitation for his audience to join him in his skepticism. Tucker and his team were keenly aware that this particular segment, with its direct challenge to mainstream economic reporting, would be picked apart by his critics on the left. They anticipated the ridicule, the accusations of misrepresentation, and the indignant fact-checks. The monologue was not just a statement of his views, it was a carefully placed bait, creating an expectation for a counterpunch, particularly from a figure like Rachel Maddow, whose analytical style often thrived on dissecting such claims. The stage was set for the inevitable, fiery response. The atmosphere within MSNBC's Studio 3A, nestled deep within 30 Rockefeller Plaza, hummed with a different kind of energy than its competitor across the dial. Here, the air was charged with intellectual rigor and a palpable sense of mission. For Rachel Maddow and her team, each broadcast was a meticulous dissection of the day's political machinations, presented through the lens of progressive analysis and an unwavering commitment to what they perceived as truth. Monitors glowed with data visualizations, research papers lay open on desks, and the low murmur of producers discussing historical precedents or constitutional law underscored the rigorous preparation that preceded each show. Maddow herself, known for her exhaustive research and forensic approach to political narratives, was in her element. Her pre-show routine was a finely tuned machine of information consumption. She moved between reviewing the meticulously prepared scripts, consulting with her team of researchers and writers, and absorbing the latest news feeds. Tonight, a particular flicker of annoyance registered as clips of Tucker Carlson's monologue from earlier that evening began circulating through the control room's internal feeds. Her team was keenly aware of his segment, of the specific points he had made about the economy and the deceptive metrics. It was, for them, a familiar dance. Tucker would craft a populist argument, often with a provocative twist, and Maddow would systematically dismantle it. A wry smile touched Maddow's lips as she watched a snippet of Carlson's segment, particularly the part where he subtly questioned the legitimacy of widely accepted economic indicators. There was an almost palpable sense of intellectual superiority in her demeanor, a confident dismissal of his premise. She viewed his arguments as transparent attempts at misdirection, designed to exploit public anxieties rather than genuinely inform. "Oh, he's really going for it tonight, isn't he?" she might have murmured to a producer, a hint of amusement in her voice. The confidence stemmed from her belief in the power of verifiable facts and logical argumentation, tools she wielded with expert precision. She felt assured that a careful, data-driven rebuttal would easily expose the flaws in Carlson's emotionally charged, often fact-light, rhetoric. The setup was complete. Maddow, armed with what she believed was an unassailable understanding of the facts and a keen eye for rhetorical manipulation, was prepared to step onto the stage and confidently expose what she perceived as Tucker's latest, most absurd attempt to distort reality. There was no apprehension, only the eager anticipation of methodically, even playfully, dismantling a flimsy argument. The laughter, she knew, would come naturally. The Rachel Maddow show began with its signature mix of incisive analysis and a dry, often cutting, wit. After a brisk recap of the day's top headlines, Maddow pivoted to what she clearly intended as the highlight of her opening segment. "And now," she announced, a slight smirk playing on her lips, "for a rather extraordinary piece of performance art from earlier this evening." The screen behind her flickered, bringing up a clip from Tucker Carlson's monologue. It was the moment of his specific provocation, his suggestion that widely accepted economic indicators were actively deceptive, a tool used by the powerful to hide the true cost of so-called growth from the average American. As the clip played, Carlson's voice, usually so commanding, seemed to take on an almost comical tone when filtered through the lens of Maddow's impending critique. The camera cut back to Maddow, and the reaction, when it came, was immediate and unbridled. A sharp, almost explosive burst of laughter erupted from her. It wasn't a polite chuckle or a condescending giggle. It was a deep, genuine, incredulous laugh that conveyed absolute disbelief and outright amusement. She leaned back in her chair, shaking her head, a hand rising to cover her mouth as if to contain the mirth that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. "Oh my goodness!" she gasped, still chuckling, wiping a tear of laughter from her eye. "Did you all just hear that? The true cost of growth? The actively deceptive numbers?" Her voice dripped with incredulity, her eyes sparkling with a mix of disdain and amusement. Her body language was one of complete dismissal, an almost physical rejection of the premise Carlson had dared to put forward. She was making it clear, without needing to say it explicitly yet, that she found his argument not just wrong, but fundamentally absurd, beneath serious consideration. The laughter resonated through the studio, a shared moment of ridicule between Maddow and her crew, amplified for her audience at home. It was a powerful rhetorical move, designed to strip Carlson's claims of any gravitas before they could even be properly dissected. She intended to frame his monologue not as a legitimate political argument, but as a laughable conspiracy theory, a desperate attempt to manipulate his viewers with baseless assertions. The dismissive laughter was the opening salvo, establishing a tone of intellectual superiority and signaling to her audience that what they were about to hear from her would expose the sheer folly of Carlson's pronouncements. The confidence radiating from her was absolute. She was certain of her victory. Following her explosive laughter, Rachel Maddow straightened in her chair, the last vestiges of amusement replaced by a steely, almost surgical focus. "All right, she began, her voice now sharp and precise. "Let's talk about those actively deceptive numbers Tucker Carlson was so dramatically warning you about." She launched into her signature, methodical deconstruction, a masterclass in intellectual dismantling. The screen behind her shifted, not to a new provocative image, but to a meticulously prepared series of charts, graphs, and direct quotes from official government reports and reputable financial institutions. She began by meticulously citing the very economic indicators Carlson had vaguely dismissed, presenting them with clear, sourced data points. When Tucker refers to the economy booming and then dismisses it as not your reality, Maddow explained, her tone didactic but compelling, he's talking about things like GDP growth. And yes, GDP is growing. She presented a crisp graphic illustrating the GDP trajectory, sourced directly from the Commerce Department. She then moved to unemployment figures, wage growth statistics, and inflation rates, each fact presented with accompanying, verifiable data. She highlighted the methodology behind these numbers, explaining how they are collected and why they are considered reliable metrics by economists across the political spectrum. Her critique was unsparing, yet devoid of the emotional fervor that often characterized cable news debates. Instead, she used a cool, analytical precision to expose what she perceived as Carlson's factual inaccuracies and logical fallacies. She dissected his vague allusions to true cost and suppressed information, contrasting them directly with transparent, publicly available data. "When you hear rhetoric about rigged systems without specific evidence," Maddow stated, her gaze direct into the camera, "that's a tell. Because the actual numbers, the ones available to anyone who bothers to look, tell a different story than the one Tucker wants you to believe." The segment was a confident display of intellectual authority, designed to leave no room for doubt in her audience's minds. She highlighted what she viewed as Carlson's intentional misrepresentation, not just of facts, but of the very process of economic measurement. Maddow and her team felt a profound sense of triumph. They had, in their eyes, not merely rebutted Tucker's claims, but thoroughly exposed them as baseless, a performative act of outrage rather than a genuine inquiry into economic truth. The segment concluded with Maddow looking directly into the camera, a quiet confidence replacing her initial laughter. The message clear. The facts had spoken, and they had unequivocally sided with her. No sooner had Rachel Maddow's segment concluded than the internet, already a tinderbox of political reaction, erupted. The clip of her initial, unbridled laughter at Tucker Carlson's monologue, followed by her systematic takedown, became an instant viral sensation. It was extracted, edited, and shared with lightning speed across every liberal-leaning social media platform. Hashtags like Maddow wins, Tucker clown, and fact-check Tucker dominated Twitter feeds, while countless memes featuring Maddow mid-laugh, often overlaid with sarcastic captions, flooded Instagram and TikTok. On the left, there was an immediate and widespread celebration. Progressives saw the moment as a definitive triumph, a public humiliation of a formidable ideological opponent. For them, it was confirmation of Tucker Carlson's absurdity and Rachel Maddow's intellectual brilliance. Comment sections overflowed with praise for her meticulous analysis, her ability to cut through what they perceived as fear-mongering and misinformation with calm, undeniable facts. "This is how you do it!" many exclaimed, pointing to Maddow's methodical approach as the antidote to Carlson's often bombastic rhetoric. The laughter, initially just a spontaneous reaction, became a symbol of their collective dismissal of right-wing narratives. It was a feel-good moment, a reaffirmation of their worldview, where truth and reason had seemingly prevailed over what they considered populist deception. Meanwhile, in the Fox News orbit, Tucker Carlson's team was keenly aware of the viral clip and Maddow's reaction. The derisive laughter, in particular, had struck a raw nerve. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a public humiliation, a direct challenge to his credibility, delivered with maximum contempt. Initial reactions from his loyalists online were defensive, accusing Maddow of elitism and condescension, of being out of touch with real Americans who understood Carlson's message. But even amidst the backlash, a quiet sense of simmering fury began to build within Carlson's camp. The laughter, intended to dismiss, had inadvertently created a powerful new motivation. Tucker himself was shown the clip. He watched it with an unblinking intensity, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. The sound of her laughter, sharp and dismissive, seemed to echo in the quiet confines of his office. It was clear that this wasn't just another night in the cable news wars. This wasn't merely about winning a policy debate. Maddow's laughter, in its utter disdain, had transformed the skirmish into something far more personal. It had become an insult, a gauntlet thrown, demanding a response that would not merely fact-check, but truly shock. The viral ridicule had, in fact, prepared the ground for a counterpunch of devastating, calculated precision. The day after Rachel Maddow's scathing, laughter-punctuated critique, the usual torrent of social media commentary from Tucker Carlson's accounts was notably absent. There were no immediate tweets from him or his show's official handles, no rapid-fire rebuttals from his network's public relations machine. A rare, almost eerie, public silence descended from his camp, allowing the celebratory din from the left to swell, unchallenged for the moment. The viral clip of Maddow's derisive laughter continued to proliferate, unchallenged, amplified by the vacuum of his non-response. Behind the polished facade of cable news, however, the silence was anything but calm. In Carlson's war room, the atmosphere was thick with a frustrated intensity. The laughter had cut deeper than any analytical takedown. It wasn't just a critique, it was an act of public humiliation, a visceral dismissal that resonated beyond intellectual disagreement. His producers, usually quick with counter-arguments, realized a standard, angry rebuttal would only play into Maddow's narrative, confirming her perceived intellectual superiority. They knew she had scored a potent psychological victory. "We can't just yell back," one producer muttered, pacing the room. "She hit us where it hurts. The laughter. It makes us look ridiculous." Another added, "And her audience believes she won, hands down, on facts." The challenge was clear: how to deliver a counterpunch that couldn't be laughed off, that would penetrate Maddow's meticulously constructed intellectual shield. It couldn't be about rhetoric. It had to be about something undeniable, something that would hit with the force of irrefutable truth. Amidst the brainstorming and the simmering resentment, a quiet, intense discussion began to form. Tucker, typically animated, was unusually subdued, his gaze distant, processing the insult. He listened intently as one of his lead researchers, a quiet but brilliant mind, tentatively offered a different approach. "What if," the researcher posited, "we don't argue her interpretation of the numbers? What if we drop different numbers? Numbers they don't talk about. Numbers that, while technically correct, paint a picture she explicitly ignored or dismisses as irrelevant." The seed of the plan was planted. It would be a meticulous, almost surgical counterattack. The goal wasn't just to win a debate, it was to shatter the confidence behind the laughter, to force an acknowledgement of an uncomfortable reality that had been so easily dismissed. The silence was not a surrender. It was the quiet, deliberate sharpening of a devastatingly precise weapon. The rare day of public silence from Tucker Carlson's camp masked a furious, almost obsessive, dive into data. The laughter had ignited a cold fury, transforming the desire for rebuttal into an unyielding quest for absolute, undeniable truth. Tucker's research team, a small but dedicated group of analysts, statisticians, and investigative journalists, became a relentless engine, sifting through mountains of information. Their mission: unearth specific, irrefutable numbers that directly countered not just Rachel Maddow's specific claims, but the very optimistic premise from which her laughter had sprung. They plunged into government reports, economic surveys, academic studies, and international comparisons. They weren't looking for obscure, easily dismissed figures. They sought statistics from sources that Maddow herself, or at least the mainstream media, could not easily discredit. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Federal Reserve, the Congressional Budget Office, the World Bank, even seemingly neutral think tanks. The task was painstaking, a methodical search for the inconvenient truth hidden beneath headline figures and polished narratives. They explored nuances in unemployment rates, the real impact of inflation on different income brackets, the long-term trends in manufacturing jobs, or the comparative living standards in specific regions. Tucker himself was deeply immersed in the process. Gone was the performative TV personality. In his war room, he was a relentless editor, guiding the research with sharp, incisive questions. "Don't just give me the top-line GDP," he'd demand. "Break it down. Who's benefiting? Where is the wealth actually concentrating? What about small business closures? What about the hidden costs that don't show up in a standard growth metric?" He understood that the power of his counterattack wouldn't come from a broad ideological argument, but from the unassailable precision of undeniable data presented in a way that exposed the blind spots of his critics. Then came the eureka moment. It wasn't a single number, but a constellation of interconnected statistics that, when viewed together, painted a stark and deeply uncomfortable picture. Perhaps it was a specific metric on consumer debt relative to income, or a dramatic spike in certain essential living costs disproportionate to reported wage gains, or perhaps a revealing comparison of real purchasing power over a longer time horizon than Maddow had cited. The numbers were raw, unvarnished, and directly contradicted the buoyant optimism Maddow's segment had projected. They weren't open to interpretation, they simply were. This was it. This was the core of his counterattack, a devastating truth that would cut through any laughter or dismissiveness, impossible to ignore. The weapon was forged, cold and sharp. The anticipation in the studio was palpable as Tucker Carlson returned to air the following night. The public, still buzzing from Maddow's viral laughter, braced for a furious counterattack, a fiery retort. But Carlson's opening monologue was notably, almost unnervingly, different. There was no immediate mention of Rachel Maddow, no direct reference to the previous night's ridicule. Instead, he began with a quiet, almost academic, confidence, his usual populist fervor replaced by a measured, deliberate tone. He started by setting a stage of shared understanding, speaking not of political divides, but of universal concerns. "We hear a lot about the American economy," he began, his voice calm, "about statistics, about growth, about recovery. And numbers, of course, tell a story. But sometimes the story they tell isn't the whole story. Sometimes they miss the reality lived by millions of ordinary people." He spoke of families balancing budgets, of small business owners struggling, of the quiet anxieties that permeate everyday life for many Americans. This initial approach was disarmingly rational, almost professorial, drawing in viewers who might have been prepared for partisan theatrics. He then transitioned into a methodical laying out of contextual information, building his argument brick by brick. He talked about historical economic trends, about the nuances of specific policy impacts, and the difference between aggregate data and individual experience. He cited economists from various ideological leanings, demonstrating a comprehensive understanding of the topic, far removed from the broad brushstrokes Maddow had accused him of using. The rhetoric was understated, the tone somber, inviting the audience to consider a different perspective without overtly challenging his critics, at least not yet. However, for those attuned to his style, subtle cues foreshadowed the coming revelation. A slight tightening around his eyes, a deliberate pacing of his words, a brief, almost imperceptible pause before he shifted topics, these were the tells. He spoke of uncomfortable truths, and realities often overlooked by those in power, phrases that carried an implicit challenge to the very narratives Maddow had so confidently championed. He was building his case, patiently constructing a logical framework that would make his eventual drop of the numbers feel like an inescapable conclusion. The quiet confidence he exuded was more unsettling than any bluster, promising a revelation that would be delivered with crushing, undeniable authority, aimed squarely at the foundation of the previous night's laughter. Tucker Carlson continued his monologue with an almost meticulous precision, laying the groundwork for the devastating revelation to come. He understood that the impact of his numbers wouldn't just be in their raw data, but in the compelling narrative he built around them. He began by framing the broader economic picture, not in terms of abstract growth, but in the tangible, everyday struggles of working families. "We are told that the middle class is thriving," he stated, his voice devoid of his usual snark. "That American prosperity is undeniable. But what does that mean when a family needs two incomes just to keep pace, when the cost of a home becomes an unattainable dream, or when basic necessities stretch budgets to breaking point?" He then introduced seemingly unrelated statistics, carefully weaving them into a tapestry of mounting pressure on ordinary households. He spoke of the increasing cost of childcare, the rising burden of healthcare deductibles, and the unseen taxes embedded in consumer goods due to inflation. Each data point was presented calmly, methodically, sourced implicitly to widely accepted but often unhighlighted reports. He created a sense of growing unease, inviting his audience to compare their own lived experiences with the official narratives often presented on other channels. He established a clear rhetorical bridge from these relatable struggles to the fundamental economic health of the nation, or lack thereof. The camera, which had occasionally cut to graphics illustrating general trends, now lingered on Carlson's face. His eyes, usually sharp with political fire, held a deeper, more somber intensity. He began to introduce specific categories of spending for average families, asking rhetorical questions designed to resonate. When they tell you wages are up, are they telling you how much more you're paying for groceries this week, or how much your monthly energy bill has increased? These aren't abstract concepts. These are the immediate, inescapable realities for millions. He deliberately chose examples that Maddow's segment had implicitly glossed over, or outright dismissed as insignificant details in the face of macroeconomic optimism. Then, with a slight shift in his posture, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, he brought it all together. "And that brings us to a specific set of numbers," he said, his voice dropping slightly, imbued with quiet gravity. "Numbers that, for some reason, are rarely, if ever, put front and center. Numbers that cut through the pleasantries and the broad strokes of economic recovery and reveal a different truth for the average American household. Because while some may be laughing at the idea of a true cost, these figures represent the undeniable burden felt by millions." The screen behind him shifted, preparing for the stark, graphical revelation the trap meticulously set. The screen behind Tucker Carlson, which had been displaying a steady progression of contextual graphs, suddenly transformed. It wasn't a flashy animation or a complex infographic, but a stark, almost brutal simplicity. Bold, white numbers against a dark background, accompanied by concise, unembellished labels. Carlson paused, letting the visual sink in for a moment, the silence amplifying the weight of what was about to be revealed. "Here are the numbers," he stated, his voice now devoid of any rhetorical flourish, purely factual, almost clinical. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, over the past 5 years, while average hourly wages for non-supervisory workers have nominally increased by 15.3%, he paused, allowing that figure to register, a number that might seem positive on its own. The cumulative inflation for essential goods and services, food, housing, energy, and healthcare, combined, has risen by 28.7%. A second set of numbers appeared below the first, equally stark. What does that mean for a family earning 75, zero a year? The very demographic we were talking about? Tucker continued, his eyes piercing the camera. It means that, despite their nominal wage increases, their real purchasing power for the basics of life has effectively decreased by an average of 9.5% over that period. This isn't theoretical. This is the equivalent of them losing nearly 7.0 in annual spending power just to maintain their prior standard of living on essential goods alone. A third, smaller graphic appeared, showing a downward arrow labeled Real Disposable Income for Essentials. He then added a final, devastating blow. And the latest figures from the Federal Reserve indicate that household credit card debt for the same income bracket has simultaneously surged by over 20% in the last 3 years, suggesting that families are increasingly relying on borrowing just to cover these rising costs, not to fund new purchases or luxuries. He pulled back from the graphic, his face now etched with a quiet, profound gravity. You can laugh at the idea of a true cost, Tucker concluded, his voice softer now, almost mournful. You can dismiss concerns about hidden burdens, but these numbers, pulled from their own official sources, tell a different story. They tell the story of struggle, of erosion, of families falling further behind despite what the top-line figures might suggest. The simple question about who pays, these numbers are the answer. They're paying, and they're paying more, even when they're told the economy is booming. The monologue ended not with anger or mockery, but with a quiet, devastating finality, letting the unassailable numbers speak for themselves. In the control room of the Rachel Maddow show, the air had gone from its usual vibrant hum to a chilling, immediate silence as Tucker Carlson's segment concluded. The producers, usually a flurry of coordinated activity, stood frozen, their eyes glued to the monitors displaying the stark, undeniable numbers Carlson had just presented. The confident chatter and quick wit of Rachel Maddow's earlier show felt like a distant memory, replaced by a cold, unsettling dread. Rachel Maddow herself, tucked away in her green room, had been watching. Her typical pre-show calm had been one of focused intensity, but as Carlson dropped his meticulously sourced statistics, her posture stiffened. The wry smile that had been a permanent fixture since the previous night vanished, replaced by a grimace of disbelief that quickly morphed into a look of genuine shock and dawning concern. Her hand, which had been resting casually on her desk, clenched into a tight fist. The numbers Carlson presented, the divergence between nominal wage growth and the soaring cumulative inflation on essentials, the quantifiable decrease in real purchasing power, the alarming surge in household credit card debt for the very demographic she championed, were undeniable. They were sourced from the same government bodies Maddow frequently cited. These weren't easily dismissed conspiracy theories or vague populist grievances. They were precise, verifiable data points that hit harder than any personal attack. They revealed a stark, uncomfortable truth that her own, more optimistic narrative had inadvertently overlooked or minimized. Her lead researcher, usually a fountain of counter-arguments, stood by the monitor, visibly deflated. He actually used their own numbers, the researcher murmured, almost to himself. The BLS, the Fed. It's all there. Maddow pushed back from her desk, the silence in the small room punctuated only by the low hum of the television. The confident swagger that had propelled her through yesterday's segment was gone, replaced by a profound unease. She understood the gravity of what just happened. This wasn't something they could easily dismiss as bad faith or ridiculous. It was a direct, factual challenge that cut deep into the perceived credibility of her own economic analysis and, more profoundly, struck at the very core of the liberal media's narrative of robust national recovery. The comfortable laughter from the previous night suddenly felt hollow, even careless, in the face of such stark, undeniable data. The reverberations of Tucker Carlson's data drop were immediate and undeniable, shattering the confident echo chamber that had celebrated Rachel Maddow's laughter. The Maddow laughing clip, once a symbol of triumph, now highlighted a perceived misjudgment as Carlson's unassailable numbers circulated widely. This forced a significant public shift. Even some neutrals and softer left viewers began to question the initial dismissal, sparking a serious debate about the raw economic data. Mainstream media, however reluctantly, was compelled to acknowledge Carlson's facts, adding legitimacy to his claims and pressuring Maddow's show to respond. The following night, Rachel Maddow's broadcast opened with a noticeably subdued and serious tone. She addressed Carlson's data directly, a stark contrast to her previous confidence. Acknowledging figures from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Federal Reserve, she attempted to recontextualize them or offer counter-perspectives, but the usual intellectual sharpness and victorious demeanor were absent. She was forced to engage with the very data she had implicitly dismissed, betraying a new caution and a loss of her easy victory. The incident left an indelible mark on both their reputations and on political discourse itself. For Maddow, her laughter became an albatross for critics, portraying her as out of touch, forcing a more careful approach to economic data. For Carlson, his calm, data-driven counter cemented his image as a credible truth-teller, exposing hidden realities. This event underscored the piercing power of specific, undeniable data in an increasingly polarized landscape. It shifted the discourse, reminding commentators that even potent emotional rhetoric could be vulnerable to well-placed facts, pushing future battles onto a more calculating, statistically grounded battlefield. Thank you for watching. If you found this video fascinating, here is another one, and don't forget to express your thoughts in the comments section.